Hey there folks, it's me TheTacticalBrit, your home of breakdowns, guides and everything in between. And I was very fortunate to go out to Gamescom, so a huge shout out to EA. This is powered by EA Game Changers, and I was very happy and very fortunate to be one of the lucky guys from Battlefield who got to go out to this event and do all the feedback sessions and capture sessions and everything in between. But this video is going to be a bit of a mixed bag today. Now, a lot of you have probably wondered, well, why didn't I release gameplay the second I had the chance to with these new maps at Gamescom? And the reason why is because I just felt that I was so bitterly disappointed with what had happened and what I had played that I almost wanted to wait and kind of collect my thoughts and do something a little bit different, something a bit more in depth, and something that I felt was a better representation of how I felt, because I felt like at the time if I'd made a video I would have been pretty annoyed and it would have translated into what was just a bad video. Most of you guys know here that I like to be relatively constructive, and that's kind of what I wanted to maintain in making this. So let's start with something positive, and the reason I say that is just because this video is going to be a mixed bag, and I really do like Battlefield 5, and I've wanted it to come good for a long time. And that was the fact that the new Metro remake was pretty damn cool. I really enjoyed it, and I think it's a fantastic take on Metro in a World War II setting, and I think hopefully it might represent a shift in dynamic when it's eventually released later this year, and I really do hope that people enjoy it as much as I did. Operation Underground for me was the highlight of going to Gamescom, and I'm bitterly disappointed that we didn't get to capture it because I feel as though the community really needed to see something this good in kind of the reaction to the stuff that they saw that was less so good. Now with that said, let's start talking about these new maps, and honestly, it's really hard. It's really hard because I can tell that these maps were made with something else in mind, but also they're just a bit disappointing. Maybe less so in the context than if the context was different, but they were disappointing. Now, had these two maps released after Al Sundan, which had been released flawlessly, and we had another large-scale Battlefield map, I think people would have gone, yeah, you know, some CQB maps would be fine. But having these two new close-quarters maps immediately after Marita is just disappointing, and also these maps, I'll be honest with you, felt really uninspired. If I were to rank them, Lofoten Islands would probably be somewhere around a 6 to a 7, if that's generous. I think probably closer to a 6. And Province, really for me, was maybe a 4. It really was not an inspiring experience. I feel as though if you actually cut out a piece of Marita and slapped it on the map and said, hey, you know that little urban bit of Marita where we just copied and pasted it 3 times? Well, that's Province, and that isn't me completely undermining the development side of things, because I'm sure that a lot was actually thought out in this, and I'm sure it was a very complicated experience in crafting a 5v5 map like Province. But the way it's been retrofitted, and in the context it's released, it really does feel as though it's just another infantry experience that isn't particularly special in a setting, color palette, and environment that we've already had over and over again. And ultimately, it just disappointed me. I feel as though Province was probably the weakest map I played on the weekend, and Lofoten Islands, whilst being interesting and certainly providing some interesting gameplay experiences, for me didn't really stand out or shine as something I'd want to continue playing at a later date. It was just another experience in the Battlefield franchise that I'd probably already had and wasn't very different. And I feel as though DLCs that offer me something new will always take priority. But at the end of the day, I guess it is content, and I'm sure some people are going to enjoy these maps, so that is a bonus too. Now let's move on to the new weapons, and we had the new material rifle, which I thought was pretty good. You know, I think anti-material rifle is one of those things that aren't actually that great a weapon, but I suppose people use them, and I actually don't agree with them being in Battlefield 5. I feel as though things like MMGs that are of a high rate of fire and anti-material rifles represent cheap kills in Battlefield 5, and I'd rather not see them in the game than see them at all. And I understand that that is taking away content, which is definitely a no-no in the current state of Battlefield 5, but MMGs and anti-material rifles just feel kind of cheap and don't feel very skillful, and almost feel like in a way they're kind of incompatible with the kind of skillful play the Battlefield 5's gunplay actually introduces. But yeah, it existed, it's an interesting weapon, and I'm sure some people will use it. Moving on, we have the 3-round burst rifle, and that was something that was actually pretty cool. A 3-round burst was pretty nice. I felt like it was a good gun, but I felt like if you actually turned it into single fire and used it as an SLR, you would be more successful. And I actually almost did that in a lot of the gameplay that I tried to get. And again, this was super sweaty gameplay, so this isn't going to be that great because I was up against loads of other YouTubers and it was really hard to get good footage. But ultimately, yeah, that was a pretty good SLR/assault rifle, and I think a lot of people are going to enjoy that one. But what was really weird about being at this Gamescom, as wonderful and as grateful as an opportunity as it was to be there, is that this almost felt kind of wrong. Like, it felt strange being here and having these maps talked about releasing and recording them when the game is in such a terrible state that it is. And it actually showed as well, because the PCs we were recording on, yeah, it wasn't really their fault because they get whatever gear they can. For those of you who go to these events, you'll know that companies do their best to source as many monitors and peripherals as they can, and they were locked to 4K 60, and whilst it did look pretty damn good, well, there was micro stuttering, and the bugs that were in the game in terms of registration being bad, and in terms of the game just running a little bit shoddy, well, that was all seemingly quite relevantly still there. And talking about these new releases kind of felt strange in the context that it didn't really acknowledge the fact that the game was in a terrible, terrible way. But I suppose that was part of the reason we were there, and I did actually attend a really good feedback session where we were talking to the developers, the community team, and a lot of the people who were involved at DICE in simply making this game better. And the universal sentiment, if I'm being brutally honest with you, is that the game is in a terrible way. And rather than, I suppose, discussing why it's in a terrible way or what led us here in the first place, it's, well, what should we do next? And that kind of critical feedback and that kind of discussion that was very constructive was great. I feel like it was hard because a lot of us did want to vent our frustrations, and a lot of us did want to go, well, you know, I'll be honest with you, it's just a bad game. It's just, I don't want to play this. But that's not helpful. That's not helpful for anyone to hear. And whilst that is a frustration I certainly have, and I find myself struggling to play Battlefield 5 these days because of some of the issues it's had, hearing that or telling a developer that doesn't really give them anything. Telling them that I think that XYZ should change in order for the better would be, and I think that that was a lot of what the guys who were at Gamescom definitely got at, and that was something I was really happy to be a part of. But whilst I was at this event, and this was probably why I didn't release the videos when I did, was that I really just had so many questions. And that wasn't about, you know, how things had gotten this bad or why they'd gotten this bad, but I just had questions. Like, for example, how is it that a 5v5 mode goes into development for so long and is suddenly scrapped? Now, I'm not saying Battlefield 5 is in a good way to support competitive. I don't believe it is, and I don't believe that making 2 maps specifically for it would have solved that issue, so to speak. I feel as though if you want a competitive game, you build that from the ground up. But how is it that somebody clearly as a development team had to do all of that? They had to do all of the competitive work. They had to build that mode. They had to mess around with all these things and craft these maps. And it does seem from the data mining, which again isn't a 100% representation of the content made, but that data mining shows that there clearly was a lot of effort into this, and there was a team behind it. Now, whether the team themselves just got something wrong, or an executive decision was made to pull the plug, that was a lot of wasted time. That was a lot of wasted time. Whoever was working on that, and this is going to sound brutal, wasted their time, because the maps themselves aren't that great, or at least they don't seem to be what the community wants at the moment, and whatever was poured or invested into this mode, it is not going to come out. It's never going to see the light of day. And again, that, you know, we've seen with co-op, for example, which, if you're just being brutally honest, is not in any way in addition to the Battlefield game and isn't that great at all either. You have to wonder how much time is being wasted on things like that, and why those developers who ended up putting all that effort in weren't doing something else, or perhaps weren't working on something else, or why the effort was even made in the first place if this decision was inevitably going to be made. And then moving swiftly on from that, there was the question of the bugs and performance. You know, I feel like in the feedback session, what became brutally clear was that this is a AAA game from DICE and EA, and the bar is so much higher. Like, the bar and standards that we have for this company and the bar and standards that I think people have for the Battlefield franchise is always higher, because DICE typically are the innovators. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a great thing, because sometimes Things like Levolution, don't really add a lot of it to the game, in my opinion. But they do kind of represent an interesting feat in terms of what Frostbite is capable of. But ultimately, my question really is, how did Battlefield end up in this state? Why did this all happen? And why are we where we are now with all of these issues? How did this summer go so drastically wrong for this game? Now, again, dwelling on that maybe isn't that great. Maybe isn't worth it. But the question has to be asked, what went wrong and why? And if there is something that is causing that problem, how can that be alleviated? Because a Battlefield and a AAA and a DICE game like this should never, ever, ever, ever be in the state that it currently is. And bearing in mind, we went through, 9 months of broken Battlefield 4. We went through a successful launch of 4 and 1 to most part. But just to have a game that seemingly had a live service that was just critically wrong, and a game that never necessarily released in the best of ways, but still released in a good way, to go so downhill, begs so many questions about what's happening over at DICE and EA in terms of what decisions are being made, in terms of, is there a workflow problem, is there a Frostbite problem, is there an update problem, is there a cadence problem? Whatever that problem is, why does it happen, why is it happening? And why does it feel as though seemingly an update can't be released without something critically going wrong? We've had 5v5 cancelled, we have Dan, which hasn't released, we have Guns, which seemingly haven't seen the light of day yet, despite both being in the game files and supposedly being promised to be released within these chapters. And it's just a lot of questions. It's why is this happening? And what makes this so devastatingly frustrating, and it's something that I touched upon whilst I was there, but something I think I've been thinking about for quite a while now, is why is it that every Battlefield game ends up doing this? Why is it that we learn so many things from previous Battlefield games and we take 5 steps forward and then 10 steps back? And why is it the Battlefield games are no longer being a generational improvement on things? And the reason I say this is because if you look across the gaming franchises, if you look across the industry, the publishers and the studios, for the most part, I think you can say that whenever a game is released and then a successor is released to it, even technologically or just to some degree, there is an effort to improve. I think Watch Dogs, for example, although a completely different style of game, kind of represents that. The first two kind of taught them what people were looking for in a way, and this new one looks fantastic. And I think it's actually doing something a little bit different, a little bit balls to the wall, and it kind of has learnt from some of the previous mistakes from the surface of things. And I think you're seeing across the industry with things like just general releases with games that people were looking for generational improvements. And I use FIFA as an example because FIFA, although 19 was critically a bad way, but FIFA 20, based on what I'd played, had made improvements, had changed and made improvements. And I feel as though I'd see everywhere else in the industry there are improvements and changes being made, but Battlefield is always going 5 to 10 steps backwards. We learned, for example, that Battlefield 3 had great gunplay, and Battlefield 5 is more or less a carbon copy of 3's gunplay to some degree, or at least the design choices around the gunplay was taken from Battlefield 3. But why isn't that happening across the board? Why isn't it happening with what we know in terms of gameplay? Why isn't it happening with things with RSP? Why isn't it happening with things with map design and tanks and the ecosystem and overall general improvements that Battlefield should be looking for, and bugs and stability and performance? All of these things seemingly to me just aren't going in the right direction despite us learning these lessons over and over again. And I felt really confused at Gamescom because we were playing these maps that, truth be told, weren't really that impressive. The game's in a really bad way, and it was just disappointing. It was disappointing, and it just shouldn't be the case because Battlefield 5, in my opinion, has the potential to be a fantastic game. But it's just failing at so many hurdles that aren't necessarily the game's fault, but just something that's happening behind the scenes. And I'm not pointing fingers or crafting accusations or anything, I feel as though everybody I speak to at EA and DICE are really great people and really trying their best to make great games. But I feel as though the question does need to be asked is how these things keep happening and why they're happening. And I really do hope that we see an improvement. And truth be told, I would love if the Pacific was this mad, mental thing that all of us go and play again, and it kickstarts Battlefield 5 back up. But I feel as though the critical errors that have been made so far in terms of the live service and the development of the game and things that are happening update-wise have made me wonder if this game has a return yet. I don't think it's possible that we're going to see a Star Wars Battlefront 2 for the new Battlefield 5, purely because of just the state it's in and the things that we're hearing and the things that are being announced. It doesn't look to be heading in a positive direction, but I really hope it does, because I really do like this game and have been impressed with it and some of the stuff that it is capable of. But yeah, I think that's about it from me today. I really just wanted to ask questions. I know that sounds weird, and I know that's maybe a little bit passive-aggressive. That's not really what I'm trying to achieve here, but ultimately it's asking questions, because I don't work at EA or DICE. That was a bit of a brain or word meld there, but I don't work at these companies, and I don't really know how things work for the most part. But as somebody who looks at the gaming industry and kind of looks at the expectations and what people kind of think about games and sort of a good read of, I feel as though, community feeling, I just had to ask these questions because they're questions that need to be asked. Why are the things that are happening, and what's coming next? But that's about it from me today. As always, folks, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon in another video.